get started. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for being here. This is the first attempt at putting something as a student group. Usually it's ITS that's organizing a lot of this stuff, but this time as students, within ITS, we have the energy program and the transportation program, and this is probably, I think, the first time in a while that we decided that there is a lot of linkages between the work that we're doing in both transportation and energy, and it's time that we kind of work towards clashing the two worlds. So we had energy graduate students and the transportation students come together to put this session together. This is our first time, and we hope to kind of make this a regular feature where we can get professionals from both sides to talk about some of the issues and things that we need to do and address as we move in the clean energy transition.
Except seems to have resulted on everybody going on strike, but
right. Yes, we do have a UC-wide strike.
I'm not sure.
But anyway, so we're and within ITS we have a chapter called Student Energy, which is actually headed by Jean, who's all the way on the other side of the room doing photography. But we're really happy to partner with NorCal to actually put this together today. So maybe I'll just pass it on to Heather to say a few words, and then I can introduce the speakers, and then we can get started.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much. My name is Heather Benner. I am the president of the Northern California chapter of the Association of Energy Engineers. We are a professional organization that meets outside of work hours often, and we try to promote not only the clean energy transition, but also focusing on how do we encourage advances in the fields of energy engineering, as well as outreach to and training for those within our purview. And one of our goals also is to reach out to the student community, because you are our future energy engineers. So we had met with Jean and Aditya a couple of times. They've come to a couple of our events, and we thought it would be a great opportunity to have a joint event between the two organizations, so that way we could continue and foster that collaboration. So like I said about the Association of Energy Engineers, we are a professional organization. We typically meet about once a month. We are the representation of the local Sacramento-based chapter. So if you are in and around the area, we would love to have you come to our events, whether in person or virtual. We've got a couple of events coming up in December. We've got a social get-together, and then in January, I believe we're doing a tour of a DGS Zero Net Energy building. And then in February, I think we're trying to do a tour of the SMUD headquarters. So I might connect with you afterwards to talk about that. Anyway, so we like getting out and seeing how energy is being used better in our built environment. So we have, I know several people online are part of our board for the AEE chapter. I know Nishant is one of the ones online, Tim Clark, and several others who may or may not be able to be online, but if nothing else, we wanted to make sure that we said thank you very much for coming and supporting this joint effort between the two organizations. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Heather. So to kind of kick things off, the idea today was to kind of, there's been a lot of talk with the ACC2 rule, and the only headline is 100% ZEVs in 2035. But that means that there is a lot that needs to be done between now and probably even by 2030, if we really have to be able to achieve that, from both the transportation side and the electricity planning side. So that was the idea of bringing all of you together here today. So maybe I'll just do a quick introduction of our panelists today. For those of you who are online, you should be able to see the camera, but start with Beth. Beth is the CEO and founder of Olivine, where she's focused on deploying technology solutions to power the grid with clean energy resources and with a focus on energy equity. She has seen multiple EV grid integration projects that have encompassed various capacities, residential, public, and fleet charging under different use cases, including projects with Electrify America and BMW Charge Forward. And her experience enables her to bring a pretty unique and valuable perspective to empower utilities and consumers to identify the path for their transitions and climate strategies. And then on the extreme right of me, we have Peter. Peter Mackin holds an MS in electrical engineering and is currently the Senior VP of Power System Studies at GridDrive, a company that specializes in utility scale energy project interconnection to the grid. He also happens to be the president of the SAC EV Association and has been driving electric cars since 2013. So he practices what he preaches. He is passionate about EVs and has an in-depth knowledge of the planning and operation on the electric grid side. And then we have Josh Cunningham. Josh is now the branch chief of the ACC, the Advanced Clean Cars branch at the California Air Resources Board. This is the branch that is responsible to develop and implement the Advanced Clean Car regulation, which also includes the low emission vehicle regulations, the GHG and criteria emission vehicle standards, and the ZEV requirements, etc., that have been defined for California over the years, including the most recently passed ACC 2 rule. Additionally, the branch is also working in developing the Clean Miles standard, setting sustainability requirements for the ride-hailing industry in California. It also manages a number of programs to support the growth of ZEVs, including fueling infrastructure, consumer outreach, and multi-agency planning. Josh has been with CARB for 12 years and counting, we hope. And I'm also, I think because gives me even more excitement, he's actually ex-TTP. So it's really nice to have, to see a TTP alum there, and hopefully more of us will join you at some point. And then we have Obadiah, please correct me if I get your spellings wrong. But Obadiah is the manager of distributed energy strategy at SMART, which is the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. His team is responsible for developing enterprise strategy for electric transportation, building electrification, solar PV, battery storage, and load flexibility. He's been with SMART for more than 20 years in research and strategy roles. He's also the VP of the Board of Energy System Integration Group, which is an international nonprofit, as well as the chair of their DER and working group. I presume DER is Distributed Energy Resources. And he is a registered professional engineer in California and has a BS in mechanical engineering from Cal Poly, and also a master's in TTP from UCLA. And then we have our moderator for today, who's Lou Fulton, who many of you know. If you don't, he is the director of our Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways program, or STEPS as we call it at ITS. And with that, I will hand it over to Lou to take over.
All right.
Perfect.
Thank you, Aditya. Okay. I don't know if I can still show up on the camera if I sit over here and then I can see people. Is that going to work? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for organizing this to the team. What's it called? The energy team, or the student energy. That's right. There it is. And I got to say, Aditya is kind of a wonder, the amount of things you do. And he's gone from being a PhD student to almost being in charge of the entire place in about 2 years. But it's great. It's great. And in fact, I think really you'd be a great moderator tonight. But I'll do it because you asked me to do it. And I'm happy to talk to everybody here. It's just a great group. So also, Aditya gave me a nice long list of questions, and I will start with those. There's a few very specific ones for each panelist, and then let's just see where the conversation goes. And I also want to give the audience a chance to ask questions, both the people in the room, the 300 people that are here, that the people online don't know there's that many, and then the people online, the 300 of those that the people in the room don't know there's that many. And we're going until what, 7:15?
Yeah,
something like that.
An hour, and then you can have about 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. Okay, so yeah, we're here to talk about Advanced Clean Cars 2. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to go through some slides, aren't I? Let's just do a very quick introduction on some facts. And this is the fact that I think many people now have glommed onto, and I guess people can't see it if you're sitting there, but it's the picture of the ramp up, and it is pretty breathtaking. I mean, we thought we were in pretty good shape policy-wise when we had to get 15% by 2025, and like we're laughing about that now, but suddenly it's 35% in 2026, and the 50% point comes like around 2028. That right there is we talk about 100% in 2035, but 50% in 2028? I mean, how are we gonna do it? So there's the schedule, but there's a lot more to it than that, and Joshua's the expert here, but I'll just quickly mention, we've got ZEV assurance measures, such as requiring consumer-facing battery state of health indicators on vehicles. That's very interesting, so you know how the battery is on your car better than what we currently get from the user interface on the dashboard. Adding ZEVs into existing service information requirements, adding useful life and minimum warranty requirements for ZEVs. Plug-in hybrids have to have an all-electric range of at least 50 miles. I'm gonna just kind of skip some of it just to get through this. Battery electric and fuel cells will need a minimum range of 150 miles to qualify under the program. They have to have fast charging capability, and I'm not sure exactly what that means in terms of kilowatts and stuff, but we can talk about that. And then the governor proposed, the legislature has approved $2.7 billion in fiscal year 2022-23, and then $3.9 billion over the next 3 years. Investments in ZEV adoption and clean mobility options for the California's most environmentally and economically burdened communities. And then my last slide, related programs. Clean Cars 4 is a program that it's like a scrappage program, and it provides up to $9,500 to low-income drivers to scrap their older vehicles. So there's been new funding for that. The CVRP, Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, is back to providing $7,000 for income qualified drivers to buy one, a new ZEV. And then the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program provides low-income car buyers with special financing up to $5,000 in down payment assistance. And then the last one here is that the governor's ZEV budget includes $400 million over 3 years for statewide expansion of Clean Cars 4 and a bunch of other stuff. So there's a lot of money coming in here to go along with all these new regs, and let's talk about it. So maybe we'll start with Joshua. And can you make sense out of all this for us? What is your perspective on the rule beyond the headline of 100% ZEVs in 2035? What is your group doing to try to grapple with some of the earlier target dates and then all these pieces of the program? How does it all make sense for you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Happy to talk about our program. 100% by 2035 is extremely aggressive. And when we started getting a sense that that was the target we were aiming for, we knew it was aggressive. But clearly from the climate emergency that we're all in, we know it's necessary. When you look at the fleet turnover and the need to actually reduce petroleum and the GHG emissions from the fleet, you've got to target sales earlier than you reach carbon neutrality by a long shot. So that's the reason we went there. I think the ramp up issue was the heavier debate. We got the governor's directive 2-3 years ago in executive order to aim for 100% if that's what we could justify, which we do feel we can justify with our cost and technology analysis. But the question of how fast we ramped up became the biggest debate, and it took us a good couple of years to work through that. We needed to look at the cost trajectory for technology. So Dr. Burke and others know this really well, battery costs are coming down, but we needed to look at how fast that was happening and how that was progressing into the battery electric and plug-in hybrid technologies, and how that is able to progress on different platforms, larger pickup trucks, smaller passenger cars. Longer range vehicles require larger batteries. So we had to do a full technology assessment to get a sense of, is it feasible for somebody to buy these vehicles in the earlier years when the requirements are not 100%, but they're high, and still receive some savings through fuel and through maintenance. And we feel we've made that case from a technology standpoint. Clearly the incentives in the early years are a critical piece to enabling the market to take off at that pace. We did not have the benefit of the federal and the state budget commitments before we adopted it in August, but we had a sense that those incentive programs were going to be reboosted. But we really do feel that for the majority of the buyers, when they're buying a battery electric vehicle, at least 300-mile vehicles, that you're going to see a lot of savings over a 10-year period of ownership. So costs were a critical piece, but the pace of ramping up in the early years was a big push to maximize cumulative GHG emissions at the fleet. So even if you reach 100% sales by 2035, and then you see the fleet implications longer term, that helps the longer term emission point. But cumulative emissions in the atmosphere are benefited by going faster earlier, and so we knew we wanted to push where we could. But to make that happen, like I mentioned, incentives is a critical piece. You mentioned, Dr. Fulton, at the beginning of that set of data points, what we call the Z assurance measures. We really felt that for us to put not just a strong requirement in place, but for the market to actually take off, because it's one thing to require the automakers to make cars. The success is only going to happen if people buy the vehicles. And so we really felt that we needed to put in requirements that the automakers provide provisions and elements of their vehicles that make them more palatable, and not just for the new car owner, but also for as the cars age and go into the secondhand users. So durability requirements on the vehicle to ensure a certain amount of minimum range is maintained as the car ages. Battery warranty requirements that the car makers have to offer to the consumer. So if the battery has problems, the automakers are on the hook for that for a certain number of years. The state of charge. Battery piece is important because we felt we wanted to make sure the car had a certain amount of value that was known to it if that buyer goes to sell it. Right, so that we all know the stories of kind of the resale market being uncertain nowadays and the value of the battery being uncertain. State of health and transparent data for the batteries we felt was important to enable better transactions in the market, and that the cars are going to maintain better value as they age for the resale market. So those are the key things that we felt was important to jumpstart.
Great. And I have follow-up questions, but let's go around the table and then we can get back to some of those. So now we'll turn to, I guess, you, Obadiah, as an electric utility planner, an electric infrastructure planner kind of guy. I mean, when you see these numbers, does that scare the heck out of you? And what is SMUD planning to do? How are you approaching this whole question of getting the infrastructure out there for EV charging?
Yeah, thanks for the question and thanks for the invitation to be here. I think trying to be the right amount of scared is what I work on every day. Trying to have people respect, what this growth is going to mean and not panic and sort of put up barriers to it or try and slow things down, but come up with solutions to overcome the challenges. For us, when we're looking at the long term, this looks like about a 40% or so increase in our load growth over the next 17, 18 years. So it's a huge ramp up. That's 2 to 3% growth when you combine that and building electrification per year. Our utility
is the ramp up including the building side as well? The 40%?
No, it's probably closer to 50%.
That's just the
building.
EVs.
Yeah, okay, EVs 40. So we've typically been dealing with 1% growth per year at the utility, and that has effects all the way up and down the planning side, the folks that do the line design, the folks that actually build the grid. All those folks are sized for a certain amount of growth and a certain amount of activity, and so just getting people to wrap their heads around needing to expand certain functionality, needing new tools, and needing to think about how we do our job quite a bit differently. Today, distribution planners design the grid for meeting a peak that is typically not counting on a lot of responsiveness from devices that are behind the meter. Tomorrow, in order for us to incorporate that 40% and not blow up utility bills, we're going to be depending on especially EV fleets, but also residential customers allowing dispatch of their vehicles or allowing some flexibility in order to make sure we're not having to build this grid even faster. And that's one of the challenges with electric vehicles and vehicles in general. They have even lower utilization rates than most electric loads. And so if we're designing for a peak that's counting on their maximum utilization, that would be a very large grid to build for. So we really need to figure out how do we shift that demand into periods that are low demand on the grid, and that how we do that efficiently and with customers buy-in and making sure they still have the fuel they need to get to where they want to go is a big mess.
Yeah. Okay.
Lots and lots of different stakeholders.
But a good mess.
And Beth is going to talk about what her company does to really dig right into that. But it's a huge opportunity space.
We're going to need Beth to help us grease the skids on this. Yeah.
wondering what word you were gonna come up with, that's a good one, yeah.
I wanted to also comment that you mentioned about low utilization rates, and that is, among other good points you made, is something we all need to keep in mind, at least for household vehicles. Not fleet vehicles, but household vehicles that are driven on average around an hour a day. So this is a 4%, 5% utilization rate. This is one of the lowest uses of valuable equipment that we have in our society. And we like the luxury of having that vehicle available. So, but maybe there's a way to take advantage of that, right? From a charging perspective. Okay, over to Beth. So you're in the energy business and charging. How do you see the rollout of EV charging going? How are you looking at the costs of infrastructure and other aspects? Do you think we have all the technology that we need? Whatever you feel like getting into.
Wow.
I know it's a lot of questions.
Yeah, well, just to be clear how our company works. So we're actually kind of sit in the middle between, say, a utility, and it could be an aggregator, it could be a you could be a OEM, because right now the players are all kind of mixed up, to be honest. Like there's not a really solid chain. The chain exists in a certain way, and then it changes and moves around, and different people are still kind of, are you an EVSE, are you an OEM, where places do you want to play? So the goal of our company is we sort of sit in the middle of all that and try, as I said, to kind of make sense of that and figure out what data is needed where, what control is needed where, and how to streamline that. So we try to sit in the center of that. We specifically try to work with different different types of parties to try to get a sense of that whole process 360 degrees, which gets a mess, but I kind of am a challenge junkie, so I like that kind of thing. But what we kind of see happening is that I really think that it slows down sometimes because you do have so many players in it trying to figure out their space and different people advocating for different kinds of policies for different reasons. And I've seen players advocate for certain policies because they're absolutely going to do a certain thing, and then they never actually do it. Examples of things are, have to do with policies or rules and regulations for the wholesale market or with the PUC. And there's like a lot of people betting on the future, which is great, but we need to get to the future. And so our company tends to be a little bit more focused on real action. How are we going to do this? What are we going to do now? So we do a lot of work with getting programs off the ground and specifically in working in the emergency space with the climate change. Like, what are we going to do about that? What technologies can, be V2G? What are we going to do with this? And where is that going to go? So we'll do some research studies. We'll also do some practical things. So we've been working on various EV and some fleets. We've done some work with fleets and school buses, things like that over the last 6-7 years, maybe a little while. I guess the thing that I always like to bring up, which is a little bit on the side, but I think that whenever we're talking about this or we read articles about these things, people are thinking about the infrastructure in a certain way. And they're not thinking about the things that need to be the glue, like what we do to bring those things together. And so people are thinking, I can do this. And lots of times people will come to us in the 11th hour because they realize they can't bring those pieces together. I think that there's a lot of I get concerned about the use cases of people on the edges. For example, we're working on a lot of projects where we're trying to get more uptake. And these are people who have already chosen to have an EV. So now we're trying to say, how can we bring more value to the EV? How can that EV bring more value to the grid? What can we do with this? Because we really believe if we can show people the value of that asset, if you can use that asset more, you're going to be more likely to buy more of these assets. And where we always find obstacles are in areas like as the price of EVs are coming down, the price of putting a charger in is not going down. Right? The price of being able to figure out how all this works, if you happen to be in a low income environment, or you don't happen to understand all these different programs that are available to you, people will just say no, they don't want it. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that everything that we do has some bent there to try to bring those other people into the mix.
Do you actually work with a lot of like household consumers who are
Yes.
looking to buy an EV?
Yes,
Okay.
we're usually indirectly, so we're usually working with somebody, we don't have the bandwidth to be like, we're not out on the street, but we do a lot of, like, for example, we are doing the I think that somebody mentioned initially, we're doing the BMW Charge Forward project, and we started that project 6-7 years ago. There's 3 incarnations, so we started where we worked with BMW, and we were working with a couple of other OEMs, and what we did is wrote a grant proposal to CEC, and did a study with CEC using BMW drivers. And then in the second incarnation, we actually, Oliver was actually working for PG&E, and what we were doing was actually using that same aggregation, but helping them grow that aggregation. And we were studying the distribution impacts. So we kind of switched, who we were working with. And then currently we're actually working for BMW and helping them actually implement the program.
Okay, great. Actually, I'll just ask you one thing. You mentioned the word emergency, and I wasn't quite, did you mean the climate emergency, or did you mean like that curve?
Oh, that's great. Great question. Actually, I really mean the climate emergency, but I would translate it into grid emergencies.
Okay.
We do a lot of work, like we actually currently work for all 3 IOUs and was a provider in the CC and the DSGS program. So during the last heat wave and in the climate emergency, what we tried to do was bring all those resources together.
Let's try to not go too wonky on the acronyms. What's DSGS?
I'm sorry, demand side grid services. It's just the program is really about bringing different resources together to be able to provide power to the grid, and EVs was a big part of that.
Got it. Great. Okay. Over to now Peter. So I know you have a couple of hats, but I don't know where they are, but but anyway, as the president of SAC EV, of the SAC EV Club, maybe tell us what that is, and then what are your thoughts on the ACC2? What does it mean for the kinds of changes and some of the things that we mentioned about how it might change the way the vehicles are? Is there anything in there that you particularly like, particularly don't like? And one other thing, how are car dealers reacting to this, and are they even aware that this is something that we think will happen, that they're going to be selling a lot of EVs in the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, okay, well, I'm afraid that question is kind of way outside my.
Okay, all right.
But I'll tell you what I think. First of all, SAC EV is a chapter of the EVA, the Electric Vehicle Association, used to be the EAA. They recently changed their names. And let me know if you can hear me, because I always talk really quiet and I get quieter and quieter. Good, okay, good, thank you. And what we are is, even though it says, SAC EV, we're really an advocacy organization, and we're advocating for clean air, less carbon emissions. So when it comes to transportation, we're not out there saying, everybody go buy an EV. What we're saying is everybody get rid of that ICE and throw it in the junkyard and get something else. And if it's a bicycle or you walk or you can ride a horse, we don't care. It's just to get the gas powered and diesel powered cars off the road. That's what we're shooting for. And we also try, because initially, in our first set of events that we had like 6 years ago, I mean, it was Tesla. And so, everybody come out and, and they ask how much they cost, and we tell them, they're kind of like, their eyes like this, and just like, and so we're trying really, really hard to get the lower cost vehicles out there so people can see them, have events in, disadvantaged communities and promote the vehicles and have people come out, I guess not on the slide anymore, but the representatives from like the CDRP and the Clean Cars for All and all that, come out and talk to them, the participants about, you know, what rebates are available and what incentives are there. You know, so we can, from ZEVs perspective, we talk about the cars and how nice they are to drive and how much fun they are. And then we have others out there to help, you know, provide the information on the incentives so that they can actually get them. You know, and another thing that we've been working on is access to charging, because you know, it's not just low income people, but people, I think it's about 50% of the people in California live in multi-unit dwellings. So it might be a condo, a townhouse, or well, mostly apartments and condos, okay? And once you live in one of those dwellings, if you want to add an EVSE or charging to be able to charge your vehicle, it's very, very tough. Because you've got to get there's not just the permits that you have to get from the city, but now you have to get approval from the landlord or the manager or both. And it can get very, very difficult. So one of the things we were working on, which didn't get signed by the governor, but we were trying real hard, and I can't remember the bill name, but we were essentially trying to get a bill passed that said, you know, starting in, I think, 2026, all the new apartment and condo construction, all multi-unit dwellings had to have charging at every unit that had a space had to have access to charging. But we didn't get that to go, but we were trying. So I don't know. What was, is there something else you want me to address? I'll try to do that.
Well, there are lots of interesting things you brought up, but one thing that I want to hear more about right now is the idea of it becoming a mass market transition rather than just a Tesla transition. Are there low-cost EVs out there? I mean, I know of a couple, but
there are a few. The Chevy EUV is under 30,000 now. Unfortunately, right now it doesn't qualify for a tax credit, but it should. Well, maybe in 2023 it will. The issues with the IRA and the battery composition and the minerals and all that is super complicated. And I don't know if anybody knows what's going to qualify in 2023.
Well, I don't think that doesn't kick in until later. But I don't know about.
Well, no, the percent minerals composition and the percent composition assembly requirements for the battery pack, they do kick in 2023, January 1. Yeah.
Okay, is that 20%?
40% for critical minerals.
In 2023, I thought it was 2024 that.
No, it's January 1.
Good, I learned something. Yep.
Yeah, and then there's also the thing about countries of concern such as China, Russia, blah blah blah. I think that's 2025, maybe. Yeah. So there's it's incredibly complicated. I could spend 2 hours talking just about.
But the refresher on the federal tax incentives starts on January 1st.
Yes.
And
yeah. So
does that need any more rulemaking, or is that going to happen?
No, it should happen. I mean, there was probably rulemaking that needs to be done at like the DOE and the IRS, because they have to put out guidance on, you know, 40% of critical minerals. What does that mean? How do you assess that and how do you calculate that?
Right.
Same for battery composition, battery. All those rules have to be put out there. Yeah, so that's still up in the air, but the law itself, I think, it's done.
Okay.
So
Great.
and you know, and don't quote me on all of that. That's just what I think.
Well, you're being recorded, so we don't have to quote you. Andy has a question. We'll give a special opportunity for Andy Burke to ask a question.
I have a comment. I would like to tell the folks that Tuesday of this week, I gave a seminar. It was called Mass Marketing ZEVs, Prospects for Vehicles with No Engines. Okay, and it was, you know, almost a 45-minute or 50-minute. And there's a video of the seminar, so I'm sure anybody can get a copy of the video of that seminar through.
Well, and in fact, in your presentation, you showed a lot of very interesting statistics, and one of them is that I forget the exact number, but the percentage of electric vehicle sales in California that are Teslas is still very high, right? Like 70% or something.
65%.
65. So that is a situation if you're looking for very affordable EVs. Okay, let's move along. I have a few more targeted questions, but let's just try to let people speak their minds here. Back to Joshua, what can you tell us about, you know, to the extent you were involved in the development of ACC2 and what that was like? What was how did they end up with, let's say, the particular schedule? You know, all these other programs. I mean, some of them are probably not things you were working directly on. I don't know, but tell us the backstory.
Yeah, I'll try not to get too far into the weeds. Of course, the emission reduction, cumulative emissions and emission targets are the critical driver for us. But I alluded to this earlier, that technology costs for the manufacturers are one of the core areas that we dive into to assess feasibility. And so we really try to get a sense of what is our independent judgment of the cost of the vehicles from the year 2026 onward when we knew we were going to be setting the rules. We have to look ahead. We talk to vehicle manufacturers, we get their opinions, we take that with a grain of salt, we do our own assessments, we talk to independent experts, and we develop our own kind of complex cost assessments of where we think new vehicle costs are going. We look at battery electric vehicles with plug-in hybrids and fuel cell technologies across all different platform types. And so the shape of that curve to a certain extent is driven by, if we were to go even more aggressive than that, it would drive up cumulative costs for the industry in the early years that we feel is not appropriate and effective for the market and the automakers. So
I believe you were looking at possibly even more faster ramp-up schedules, right?
Well, you asked about the rulemaking. So part of what we do fundamentally as a regulator is we have to take into consideration all kinds of different stakeholder voices. And we as the staff have to come to the table and present what we think is a feasible regulation that's as aggressive as possible. We're always getting pressure from different stakeholders to go more aggressively, including from our own board. So we knew that our board was leaning towards, you know, of course, 100%, can we go even faster? And so we have to manage that. And we have to make sure that we have some good responses when they ask us, why can't you go faster? And some of it does come back to the grid. We see that there are challenges ramping out EVSE networks for the chargers, including at the multifamily unit housing and lack of access for people that are low income that don't have a single family home. Or it's the electricity price uncertainty, and can we ramp up on Obadiah's side, distribution and supply issues fast enough? And so we take those into consideration to a certain extent. That's a second level effect compared to the vehicle costs. But I would say that the biggest complexity of this rulemaking that we haven't dealt with in the past is the kind of the environmental justice, the low-income consumer side of this, where in all the prior zero-emission vehicle regulations, we were talking about going from 1% to 2% sales requirements, or an ACC1, gasoline cars 1. In 2012, when we adopted that by the board, the projection was at most 15% sales by 2025. But now we're talking about 100%. We had to look at every single use case to make sure that we weren't going to put somebody out of the market. Or let me say it a different way, the risk that we wanted to avoid is that we're not creating a situation where a lot of buyers just can't buy a new car anymore, right? And then you get into a situation where the new car sales rate goes down overall, automakers may go bankrupt, or people hold on to the older cars, you have gross polluters. There's all kinds of secondary effects that are not what we want. And so we had to look at the lower, not low income individuals who tend to buy used cars, but the lower end of the new car market. Do we see the technology progressing in those later years? They're going to be in the types of cars they buy and at the price points, and we think we do see that, but we had to really take all that into consideration.
But you see the later years, I mean,
Later years.
The earlier years.
Well, yeah, so 35% in 2026 is big, but it's not every single buyer, right? And so you can assume that the people that drive the long distance SUVs, maybe that part of the market is going to flush out the later part of the 100% segment. And so the automakers will manage the demand based on where they see customer needs are, but we don't have to guarantee that every use case is gonna be there in 2026. We just have to get a sense, is there enough product diversity coming to the market? You brought up the question about Teslas and the price points, and a big part of what we look at is talking to automakers. Are they bringing products out there that are not just the Chevy Bolts that Andy and I drive, but they're on the longer range platforms? Are there all-wheel drive functionality coming out to the market soon? And we have a sense that that is happening. And so product diversity is a big piece for us to consider in the early years, to kind of consider, is it feasible to go to 35%? So,
Well, we have a couple of pickup trucks now.
Yep.
That's
yeah,
seems to be important. Anybody else want to comment on that general thread? I thought maybe Peter's, but you don't have to.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And anybody can jump in anytime. Let's just kind of begin to open it up here. So, kind of, I guess, a similar question for you, Obadiah, but I don't know if you directly, have been that involved with this, but what do you feel, let's put it this way, what do you feel about the other policies that are in play here that maybe relate more to the electric utility side, and whether SMUD would say you have what you need policy-wise to do your part, to move really fast, and there's all of this make-ready infrastructure and everything else that has to happen pretty quickly from that schedule.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would say, the costs for charging, deploying charging at multifamily and deploying charging at workplaces and other public facilities is pretty challenging, and it's pretty challenging for private entities to make successful business models earning enough revenue to pay back those capital costs once you factor in grid costs and actual charger costs. Getting that in at new construction is critical. So as Peter alluded to, getting policies in place where if you're building a building and parking spaces, you're putting in charging or conduit for charging is super critical. We built a new facility, and the cost to build charging at new construction was 1/10 of what the cost was to go back in and retrofit that charging in. So getting that done early is a key policy space. I think Joshua also alluded to some of the budget that's allocated in the state budget. Unfortunately, I saw we're facing a deficit of several tens of billions of dollars next year, and so which makes me worry that maybe some of that multi-year sustainable funding for infrastructure could be challenged in a turbulent budget time. And so having durable policy mechanisms that can allocate funding over time and are not just 1 year go, 2 years go, and trying to push that out the door, that can be really challenging. We have a LCFS policy at CARB that many of the utilities are somewhat dependent on for funding infrastructure, and a lot of the commercial infrastructure going in is being financed on the basis of future LCFS funding streams. That, speaking of stability, the prices there have fallen from $200 to $60. We're gonna sell our credits for later this year. $200 was a year or two ago. So for us, program budgeting and allocating staff and getting contractors spun up and trained, and this is the volume we're looking at, and now it's collapsed by 60%. And maybe it's gonna ramp back up, but just that up and down, if you think of, especially in the private business sector, people staffing for that and responding to those policy signals and incentive mechanisms is challenging. So yeah, how do we think about creating more durable policy mechanisms on the funding side? I think is pretty critical for getting a lot of this infrastructure built.
Let me just add something to the certainty piece that Obadiah is hitting on. One of the reasons that we know that we not only have to go to 100%, but have some aggressive trajectory is that fundamental aspect of what we're trying to do is to push the industry to make their long-term investments by the automakers. So manufacturing capabilities, supply chain certainty by the different manufacturers to make the pumps and the batteries and the motors. The policy targets, when they're aggressive, set clearer signals for those investments. That doesn't help in the near term with the chip shortages or the lithium shortages, but it helps with long-term corporate investments and longer term cost declines for the technologies at the end point. And to a certain extent, some of the earlier targets help nudge that to happen faster. But we recognize there are immediate issues that have to be addressed.
There is a difference between what the OEMs are facing and what any actor that's just, let's say, in California is facing, right? At least the big ones, the international OEMs have the opportunity to sell their cars in multiple markets, or let's say around the United States maybe, which gives them some hedging, right? Although California is a pretty critical piece of that puzzle and the lead, and really is the leader on ZEVs. But if you're only going to invest in California, then I suppose this becomes very, very important whether and how this plays out in California. I wanted to follow up and just ask a kind of a naive question. Why can't you just rate base everything and call it a day?
Well, so we are a publicly owned utility, so that means that we're owned by our, the folks that pay electric bills in Sacramento. And so, anything that we build into our rate base, which is really an investor-owned utility term, but nonetheless, like any capital that we spend has to be paid for by our customers one way or another, either through their immediate rates or through paying off long-term bonds that we finance into like future rates. So, so that's one back pressure in our publicly elected board. Anytime we go for a rate increase, that's an area of criticism of like, hey, you're not being a good steward, your rates are going up. So we have to be careful about our capital spend and making sure like it's appropriate, and we're doing a good job of balancing participant and non-participant benefits as we think about like how to allocate capital. But more generally from that non-POU specific, utility-wide, why can't we just rate base everything? It creates upward pressure on rates. Rates in the electric sector are predominantly volumetric, which means you're spending capital and you're putting that in a kilowatt hour charge. And then now, people are putting solar on their roofs, and so there's maybe fewer kilowatt hours sold, and that those capital costs get allocated against fewer kilowatt hours. Fortunately, EVs are gonna spread that back out again, but it's still not caught up with the pressure solar has put on investor and utility rates. Which means if you're in San Diego and you have a plug-in hybrid, it's cheaper to, or it used to be cheaper before this year, to fill up with gasoline than to plug into the wall and charge your car, which is crazy. But that's because we've stacked a lot of capital costs into rates. So you have to be careful.
But now gasoline is $6 a gallon. That's
forever,
Yeah.
forever. So you have to be careful about the capital costs you stack in rates because it can create rate pressure. And I guess just briefly tagging back to my comment about the mess, a big part of the debate is whether we use rates or direct utility control to affect, the dynamic charging of EVs. And rates could be a great mechanism, but getting into how we structurally change our rates is a big challenge. And some of you may be aware the PUC just dropped a net metering 3.0 proposal for rooftop solar this week. There's going to be a ton of debate over that over the next month. Pay attention to a couple of the articles. You'll see the complexity involved when you have a stable rate, what looks like a stable rate structure mechanism, and you try and change that on someone who's made investments against that. And that's what the solar industry has, built a huge industry around the net metering structure. That's going away, and there's going to be a lot of outpouring of resistance to that. Utilities are anxious about like, how do we then move into a rate structure that better aligns EV charging to times of needs, and they're facing regulatory back pressure against that, as well as uncertainty of like what expectations are we creating, what industry inertia are we creating with this new rate structure that we offer.
So net metering 3.0, okay, we'll all have to learn about that, but that's kind of what you do, right? The distributed systems, and rooftop would be part of that.
Yeah, that's a part of it.
Okay. Okay, so yes, Peter, go for it.
A couple things. One thing that Luke didn't mention is that, SMUD does have their zero carbon by 2030 plan. And I think there's like 4 legs to the stool, maybe there's 3, but in any case, one of them is no rate increases beyond the rate of inflation. So although they're getting a relief here because inflation's gone so up so much. But they do, yeah, they do have a, the board has already said they don't want the rates to go up, so, you know, and I think Lou mentioned that. And the other thing I was gonna mention too was that, you know, when it comes to, you know, pricing, well, for NEM, I haven't seen the latest NEM3, but typically when regulators go in and they say, we're gonna change the way DER is compensated, they usually grandfather the ones that are already in service. So that protects people that have, as Lou said, made an investment and expected a rate of return. They're protected, but the new guys, they're the ones that have to deal with the new rate.
There is some grandfathering for commercial, but not as much for residential.
Love it. So for NEM3, the newest one,
Yes.
but how long is it? Is it 5 years or something? Or?
Yeah, it's something short like that, yeah.
Okay.
Hence the debate.
Yes.
Yeah, but you know, it's totally a little bit of a tangent, but Obadiah mentioned it, it's not just those big industries like solar that made a lot of investment, but those people have a lot of clout, right? That industry has a lot of clout. It's that I think we still need a lot of, and those are not necessarily the new innovators that are coming in and it's gonna help us. And if we don't have mechanisms and approaches where people can make money, you know, and Obadiah touched upon this, where if we can't make money and people can't come up with business models that make sense, you are going to keep relying on the same people, the same mechanisms, the same industry. And this isn't about being the same, right? This is about doing things differently. And you want to have an ecosystem that has a lot of different types of players. And right now, by doing that, you get messier. So it gets messier before it gets better. But I think you want to have other players. And I think that one of the things that we don't really have right now is that kind of, it's not clear how a lot of people are going to make money. I mean, even when we were talking earlier, I've been in this business for a long time. And I've done a lot of projects that relate to EVs. And none of those projects, I can tell you, I made no money on any of them. Right?
So business models.
Business models. I mean, not to say that some of my costs are covered in a few things, but it's like, it's just not there yet for a lot of, you know, for a lot of players that we actually do need in order to get to that number.
How much of that is just straight up related to that putting in charging and trying to earn money off of investments in charging systems are suffering from the fact that they're tending to have very low, you know, utilization so far?
I'm sure, I don't know what the percentage would be, but it's certainly probably a pretty high percentage.
Was that kind of one of the core?
That would be one of them, but I think that, again, I think there's a lot of players here. And there's a lot of different business models and creative business models that could be brought to bear. And I think if we just, I mean, yes, I know Tesla's business model was pretty successful for Tesla, but an awful lot of, we can't just recreate that as being sort of the standard business model. And I think there's a lot of innovation that can be put in place that would really help to get, to have us reach that number, because it's just, if you, I guess I used to live in Detroit, I come from Detroit, and I have a lot of friends that are work for the car industry. It's not the car, it's all the pieces around it. It's all the suppliers to the cars, it's all the infrastructure around it, it's all the other things. The auto industry isn't just the automakers. And I think that we need to think about that in regard to energy and EVs and the OEMs, and how we're talking about that nexus. And what are all the players around that? And how can we create an industry that brings pieces from all that industry together, and that there's lots of different business models that can thrive and be targeted in different areas, different income, multi-tenant buildings. You know, there's going to be different business models that I think are going to need to be applied and work, or at least be adapted to these different areas.
Is there any particular policy or set of policies that you would advocate for?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew exactly what that would be, because I would be advocating for it right now. I think that this is going to sound silly, but I don't think it's necessarily about the policy. It's about all of us in the industry really, you know, most industries, when you see a really big change, if I go back and I look at really big changes in industry, things that have really had social impact, there's a huge part of it that's policy, but it's also about the players doing what's right. right? It's about the players having a mission and thinking about what they're doing. And so I tend to call upon my colleagues and industry players and say, we should be doing what's right and thinking about it, because policy will fall out of that. And it's really about some of the actions that we're taking. And so that's the thing, that's the kind of the call to action that I keep bringing up.
Great, okay, so it's 6, almost 7, for me, it's gone very quickly. So why don't we see if there are questions, and I can always keep asking. Well, you had one already.
No,
so-
I made a comment. I made a
I see a
comment.
young lady behind you, I'm gonna call on her, but we'll get back to you, yes. To you, Minal.
My question is for Josh. Well, you said like California is aggressively pursuing 100% ZEV adoption. And there is clean cars for all that is giving incentives to low-income drivers to scrap their own cars. But I want to know your thoughts, like what if you had a in general mandatory vehicle scrappage policy? Will that not add on this, this drive to get to 100% ZEV?
It's the send cars to Mexico policy.
Yeah, that's right. That's a very fair question. There are some countries around the world that do have early retirement requirements based on age or usability, and we just don't do that in the United States. I think part of it is that we try to protect the needs for truly lower income households to kind of hold onto their cars for as long as they can afford. If we were to scrap cars early, that starts to propagate the price up the chain for the used cars and then the new cars, and that creates risks on the household budgets. But yeah, right now we are trying to incentivize the used car buyers to go and get an EV through the Clean Cars for All and others, and that really helps spark from the demand side the purchase on those used EVs. And so that's partly why we were trying to play in that game. Our requirements are on the new car manufacturers, but if our rules, when they go into effect, where we require battery information and we require warranty requirements on the batteries, we hope that makes that used car more valuable, and it makes it more likely that that household that's going to buy a used car will buy one of these vehicles as compared to a 2010 Leaf or something that's not as valuable. So
I'm trying to remember what is in there as an incentive for secondhand vehicles. And then there's something in or maybe it's in the IIJA or it's in IRA, but there's a national secondhand vehicle thing too now, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a myriad of policies for the incentive side, and I don't know all of them, but I do know at the federal level, the federal incentive program for the first time puts in place a second incentive on that vehicle when it's resold, which is really a good thing.
Yeah. $4,000.
Yeah, it's really a big deal.
And each vehicle can only get it once, right? You can't keep selling it back and forth.
Right. Yeah, the one angle that we're taking within the regulation, we don't regulate the prices of the vehicles, but one of the things we added in with the involvement of our environmental justice stakeholders was providing an optional, if the automakers were to optionally choose to make sure that car, if they were leasing it, for example, stays in California. Let's say Volkswagen is leasing a car to somebody, and after 3 years, if they can assure that that car is resold in California, we'll give them a couple of extra credits, because commonly they get sold out of state. And so we're trying everything we can to try and drive that market. But I think your question is a good one. Ideally, if we could get those old cars off the road, and ideally even further, target the ones that are truly gross polluters, and even pay people to get those cars off the road, that'd be ideal. But at the moment, we're not going there.
Maybe we'll, there's one back there, okay. If that person still has a question, yeah.
So I essentially had a question about, so recently I saw a video made by Ford about a startup based in Tel Aviv, Israel called Electrion that is speaking about electrifying roads. So the idea is to essentially being very mindful about the fact that we do have limited supplies as far as the minerals that we need to make those cars and batteries. And so how about shrinking the size of those batteries and electrifying roads? The technology is based off of Nikola Tesla's technology, so it's wireless. It would essentially create jobs and provide, the automotive industry with a lot of new opportunities to balance the energy issues that you mentioned earlier as far as solar and grid. What are your take on that? Because I feel like it's kind of like a utopia in a way, but.
So just to clarify, so this Electrion technology, that's an in-road inductive charging, yeah, which is not the most efficient thing in the world. You're gonna end up using a lot more energy, but you could have smaller batteries. I don't know, any reactions?
Well, I'll just throw out a couple of comments. I think we need to encourage those types of technologies in general. The first hurdle you run into though is just the time and cost to tear up the roads and add in that equipment underneath the pavement. So things like that could be put in, but likely would happen at the time that road gets repaired or redone. And so we should be looking into that option. Generally this hits on something that Lou, you were talking about the utilization of the vehicles and the batteries. And I'll come back to your point that the price pressure on these cars and the technology costs we had to look at when we developed the regulation, a lot of it is driven by the range of the vehicles. So we did assume that on average, somebody's buying or is going to demand a car and not be willing to buy a car unless it gets at least 300 miles of EV range. And that inherently for an electric vehicle means you're driving the price up because the incremental cost of the car is more range means more cost. So ideally, if you had inductive charging in the roads, you could sell that car for lower cost because it's got a smaller battery and it's getting recharged as it's moving along. So ideally, I like the idea. I just think that the automakers can't count on that just yet. There's a lag in the time to get the roadways rebuilt. But I do see kind of the first steps, which would be stationary inductive charging, where a car pulls up and sits there. Maybe it's at a bus stop for a bus, or if it's in a parking lot, it can recharge easily when you're shopping, and you don't have to worry about exactly plugging in, But the longer term idea of move, while you're moving the vehicle, may happen, but it's much longer term down the path.
But more closer to home right now, I mean, we've got fast charging, we're getting toward ultra fast charging, and there is also a trade-off, right, between how much we recharge and fast charge versus how big a battery pack we need. And I think about that because of the critical materials that are in batteries and the cost of cars, but we're having a hard time getting enough charging out there. I don't know if so that just put that on the table as well. If anybody else has comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting idea, but in addition to the issues that that Joshua raised, there's also the issues of okay, how are you gonna charge them for the charging energy? Where how is it going to be metered because the car's moving, and if they transition between different utility service areas or different CCAs, and it's not an insurmountable problem. It's just something else that you have to consider. The other thing that I would point out is, I mean, it can work technically on like freeways, especially on freeways, because you can put the inductive charging within all the lanes of the freeway. But California's got thousands, probably maybe I don't know if it's a million, but they got many miles of secondary roads that go up into the mountains and go all over the place. And if you have a very limited size battery pack that say is only 50 miles of range, you're basically going to be stuck within, you can only travel within 50 miles of the freeways. So that means you have to put that inductive charging in a lot more highways than you may initially have thought of. So and that adds to the cost. So I'm not saying it's not a good idea. It would actually be kind of an interesting thing to just try out and see if people would go for it. But that's just my thoughts off the top of my head.
I know we had one student do their dissertation on laying out, I don't know if you looked at both inductive charging and catenaries, but I think it was the concept of it and just how big a system would you need so everyone could charge. It was about probably 8 years ago, so it's not a brand new idea, but I bet you could find it. Did you follow up?
We actually did a study, we actually did a project in Southern California with a city, and we were using their buses and we used inductive charging. So I'm a little more, I guess my reaction was fairly positive to that, except that, to your point, it wasn't, at this moment, it wasn't cost effective because you're using a lot more energy and the technology wasn't quite as reliable. That doesn't mean it won't be though in the near future. And what we did is work bus schedules so that, and these were like city buses that could stop at a certain point and be charged so that they didn't need the battery, you know, they could charge the battery. And it did work. And I thought we tried several different types of technologies and that one did work. The only thing I would say is it was probably just a little bit early, so it wasn't quite as reliable as you would hope.
And there's another aspect in my question I forgot to mention is the implementation of VMT. As someone who's born and raised in Europe, and you know, having had access to public transit and seeing that public transportation is not really a thing in the United States.
Some people do have access.
Yes, but at the nationwide level, the average nationwide level is compared to the average European country, it's a very different way of approaching transportation systems.
Yeah.
And so what I'm thinking, and that's, we're talking 30, 40, maybe 50 years from now, is just, you know, changing the culture around transportation. That maybe, you know, if people thought that taking public transit would be a more efficient way and a cleaner way to, you know, solve our climate crisis and still have those vehicles that have smaller batteries, but that would rely on inductive charging, eventually we could maybe come up to a solution that sort of solve or achieve the goals that we're all trying to achieve here.
Yeah, I'll react to that. Tangentially, I'm really pleased that you brought up vehicle miles traveled, VMT, because it doesn't get talked about enough, partly because we don't have inherent mechanisms we don't have policy levers that are easy to turn. You know, it's a behavioral issue, it's a pricing issue, it's a mobility issue. There are really hot debates that come out of it. But I always try to emphasize the need to reduce VMT, even if all the cars were electric. We have to address VMT, otherwise we're stuck in traffic jams, or otherwise we have communities that are not healthy and you've got safety issues and intersections that are just congested. So it's a fundamental issue. And to Obadiah's side, if we didn't address VMT and everybody's driving electric vehicles, we have a grid supply challenge. We've got more power plants, more solar panels, more distribution charges you're dealing with. And so addressing VMT really helps relieve some of that pressure on the grid or hydrogen, you know, fuel production side. So we always need to be bringing that up. The new scoping plan that just came out this week from our agency that talks about all the strategies we need to do to get our carbon neutrality, it probably is not going to get a lot of press, but we have targets in there needing to get to at least 20% VMT reduction by 2045, or else we're going to have to do even more grid supply issues or carbon capture and sequestration or biofuels or everything else.
So the scoping plan's out?
Just came out yesterday.
Okay, so that's a must read. ARB's view on how we're gonna get to zero kind of thing.
I'll just throw out one more thing that your comments made me think of that I was also wanting to tie back up from a grid planning standpoint. The future and like what the future of transport looks like 10 years out, 20 years out, if you think about the amount of change we're experiencing right now is pretty uncertain, and we haven't talked about autonomous vehicles here tonight yet. I'm not sure if COVID killed them, but I do hear that they are on road.
Only share it, didn't kill autonomous.
Yeah, okay. And that could be a large change in terms of how we charge vehicles. It could address some of the critical minerals constraints. It could address some of the traffic constraints. From a grid planning standpoint, large uncertainty about like, do we mandate every parking space in the future has electric charging with the current charging port standard or with inductive charging? Or are these going to be charged in barns, you know, in central locations and kind of redistributed to flow with, you know, travel demand? But there's a lot of uncertainty about that and a lot of worry about stranded asset risk as we go all in on one charging vision for the future, and we're at like 3% of the market right now, or 5% of the market in terms of like vehicles on road. We still got a long way to go, and a lot of those options you mentioned should be thought about as we're thinking about infrastructure.
Yeah, I think in the last 3 minutes, 4 different possible shortages have been mentioned.
Yeah.
Critical materials, road space, charging infrastructure, and now I'm gonna blank on the fourth one, but I mean, you know, will we have enough vehicles, I guess is the one.
Well, there's the electric grid.
The grid, that's it, that's what I meant,
Yeah.
yeah, so we're
And
fine.
since you raised that, come on, let me ask you.
Yeah, we're gonna let you go next, but I don't wanna.
I guess what I'm gonna say is, I can give you the, the short answer, or I can just, cut to the end and tell you that maybe it's not as bad as you think, because it probably isn't.
Good, thank you for that, we needed that. Okay, Andy,
Yes, it's, what is the enforcement mechanism that you envision to force the combination of the companies and the customers? Because CARB's been trying to get up to 25% since 1998. And I keep telling Dane Sperling that, and he says, yes, you're right. And he says, that worries me too.
Well, so it's not, I'll address both of those quickly. We're not envisioning enforcement. We have state law authority to charge a certain minimum fine for automakers if they don't meet the requirements. And so it's based on credits, but on average, if the automaker misses their target, doesn't sell electric car that they have to, they're gonna be fined $20,000 per car. So they are motivated to sell the vehicles. We have some flexibility built in for credit trading, et cetera, but that's the way we enforce it. We have to get the US EPA to give us a waiver to be able to have the authority to enforce, but we expect that. So that's how we enforce, and how they manage that is with pricing at the dealership, right? So if General Motors is having a hard time selling the bolts, which they need to comply with our rules, they'll provide discounts to those buyers and jack up the price on the trucks or something else. So they manage it through their pricing strategies to get the sales mix they need to meet our requirements.
So this must be very different than the first electric.
Yeah, so yeah, you mentioned
Because
1990.
that wasn't very successful.
1990, the first law was passed, it said 100%, what was it, was it 10% by 1998? I forget exactly what the numbers were, but the regulation was changed multiple times in the 2000s to scale back.
Because it wasn't being met.
well, we didn't have the technology yet.
Right, the industry was not quite ready, customer base wouldn't have been ready for those price points. So I don't think the market would have been able to support that.
And then the second question is, where do fuel cells come into this picture?
Yeah, so our requirements are zero emission vehicles. That includes fuel cell. Fuel cell vehicles are electric vehicles, they have onboard hydrogen storage, as you know. We expect the automakers to sell some of those to meet their compliance. Toyota and Hyundai are the two manufacturers that are selling products on the market today with the Mirai and the Nexo. It's just that the cost for fuel cell vehicles is still high, the hydrogen supply is limited. Both of those are improving, but they're improving at a slower pace than the battery technology. So we think they'll be part of the market, just a small piece.
California may be about to get $1 billion, maybe, to work on this,
Right.
well, over a bunch of years.
So hydrogen.
Did somebody else have a comment about hydrogen?
Yeah. Yeah, I think.
No, it got turned off somehow.
Push it up.
Yeah, I guess I would say if you're gonna use green hydrogen for something, don't use it in a car. Use it in something else, like use it to make fertilizer, use it to decarbonize steel. Use it there first.
The only problem is we don't make fertilizer or steel in this state.
Well, that's true, but it makes no sense to take the efficiency hit to create green hydrogen and put it in a fuel cell, and then another efficiency hit when you could just put those electrons into a battery car and get maybe 3 times the miles per kilowatt hour from the source. Yeah, it seems crazy. That's just my personal opinion, but.
We have one online. Let's go to the one online question we have here from Lucas Beslow. And it sounds like V2G, vehicle to grid movement of electricity may be necessary in the future. Are there requirements that OEMs make their vehicles have that capability to do V2G? And secondly, are there considerations on how to properly compensate V2G participants for their batteries' increased degradation? More cycling, higher power discharge equals degradation.
Well, I'll be quick, and then I'll pass it off to one of my colleagues. No, our automobile requirements do not require at the state level vehicle manufacturers to have VGI capability. We think that likely will be a rule we'll consider in the future years, but not at the moment. But in terms of the grid policy prices and grid regulator prices, I'll let Obadiah or that particular.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that V2G is coming faster than we think, and the F-150 was a big part of that, and I think we're gonna see competitive pressures amongst automakers to offer that as a feature to customers, be a big driver for V2G.
Is that the gold standard, that F-150 is what you want to see from other vehicles?
They did a Super Bowl ad about it, so.
But does it have
First to market wins
Does it have better
sometimes.
capabilities than ours?
It's got a bigger battery. But I think we are gonna see some growing pains as getting the V2G inverters to kind of coalesce with the PV inverters. They're not that different of a technology, and but right now they're like a 5 to 10x price difference.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I totally agree, it's really there. I mean, all the things, all the car manufacturers that we're talking about too, and all the projects that we're looking at are almost always V2G, because that's where the additional value is, right? That's where the additional, like when people are looking at that from bringing a business model, they're seeing that as the next place for the value. So I don't think you need any kind of regulation. It's gonna be competitive pressure.
Well, we're getting some more hands, and we can keep going a little longer, yeah?
Yeah,
We'll get those two, but that one, yeah.
roughly like a third of Californians live in a multi-unit dwelling. And I'm just kind of curious about like how we think we're going to get those sales to those people, given how challenging it is with current infrastructure to actually get charging in those places. And obviously, there's a lot of different approaches. I think California is kind of leading the country in terms of what they have in terms of incentives already, which is good. But the uptake is very, very slow, and the utilization of what funding already exists is not super great. So I'm just curious what you guys think, how that's going to develop. Are we going to kind of shift our culture towards more charging at work, maybe? There are other strategies, or kind of what's the thought about multi-unit dwellings?
I'll just real quickly add my 2 cents. Absolutely, it's a challenge.
So it's just in case there was any issue with the mics, it's a question about multi-unit dwellings and how are we gonna get sales and infrastructure for the.
Yeah, because it's an access to home charging issue with apartments. And so one angle the state is taking is, and Obadiah addressed, comment on this, new building requirements in California do increase from time to time as we go through code cycles. Increasing the requirements on new apartment buildings to have more charging when they're built is a key lever, but that only affects new construction. Utility investments at the IOU level, maybe at the SMUD level too, are helping with the used by the older buildings, so that helps. But the other kind of just market mechanism is more fast charging at the community level. So not everybody's gonna have a home charger. It does provide cheaper electricity, but there are gonna have to be some EV owners that operate more like a gas station model where you might go to that fast charger once a week. It's a little more expensive, for sure, but we need to be able to, see a network growth to provide those kinds of options at the community level. But we ideally want to increase as much home charging as we can.
Why don't we let, well,
Yeah, just
I
really,
figured you.
just a really simple comment. It's not a little more expensive, it's a lot more expensive. And even with the price of gas as it is now, it's almost on a par if you have to do commercial fast charging, rather than charging at home. It's so you gotta be able to have either charging at home where you can get that discount rate, or workplace charging where you could get an equivalent lower rate. The employer, you have to work something out with the employers. And daytime charging is actually, if you look at, the duck curve's probably old news now, but because the daytime solar, because that's when you have most of the production, and solar is the most cheapest new resource that we can add to the grid. Being able to charge EVs during the day when the sun is shining is really the absolute best option, if you can figure out a way to make it work.
One thing that I kind of hear in all the conversation, and that we're not directly talking about, is education. And I'm not necessarily even suggesting the consumer education, like in the projects that I run, the biggest obstacle is the people who are sort of involved in, I guess, in this training. Like, I don't know how many people have bought an EV in the last couple of years, but the salespeople do not know how to sell EVs. They do not know what the opportunities are. I mean, that's just a simple example. And if we're talking about building owners, we're talking about, you know, all these different parties that have to be involved to make this happen. I think education is a really key component here that is sort of missing in sometimes in the discussion. Like, we think, okay, if we have the technology, or we have this policy, or we have this incentive, but a lot of incentive has to do with education and actually understanding why we're trying to get here and what the impacts are. And I think that tends to be missing sometimes in the conversation. And I know in several projects we've run, and there was a comment earlier about, like, do the car owners, or how do you deal with that at the dealership? And we were involved in several projects where there was some really lucrative incentives that were being offered in specific dealerships, because we were working with like CCAs or utilities that had in that specific geographic location. And I don't want to say the obstacle was, but certainly part of an impediment to some of those vehicle sales was the lack of education from the salespeople, because you can't expect the consumer to actually know all this. And I think if we take a look at all this, there's a component of education along the lines that could actually just be enough to tip the scale.
And we are getting kind of over time here, right? We had
One
one,
last question,
let's take
Gerard.
one last question, and then maybe we'll do once down the table, let people say whatever they feel like. Okay.
So this is super in the weeds question for Obadiah, but I was wondering how the price of LCFS credits have impacted SMUDs, or maybe just the market's interest in installing EVSE, since the prices kind of decreased dramatically.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, you know, from a budgetary impact, it cut our planned budget by about 60% for next year, as an example. And so that's, you know, that's money that's flowing out to businesses that are installing chargers and looking at our targets. Hopefully we're not gonna have to like close our programs at some point, or we may just backstop that with, you know, other budget and eat the rate increase implications. But yeah, it's uncertainty in the market as you have these kind of fluctuating funding sources. So that was roughly the impact we saw.
Okay, so we can go down, we'll start with Peter. And any last thoughts about anything you didn't hear that you'd like to say, but also, and you don't have a lot of time to react here, but what would you say is the most pressing research question? What don't we know that a group like our TTP students and our EG students, our transportation and our energy students can help with? That is a burning question for you. It's always worse to be the first one that everybody else gets time to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, because I have the two hats, right?
What's the other hat?
The grid engineer
Yeah,
and
grid
the
engineer,
EV advocate. It would be when you're, you know, and I think, you know, that was the whole kind of purpose of this get together too, was to try to, you know, when you're learning about transportation, when you're learning about energy, you know, you kind of have to, you know, you almost like be a jack of all trades in some of these areas, so that you know at least a little bit about it, so that you know, you can make informed decisions about what you're doing. You know, because you don't want to say, well, okay, I'm going to build, you know, if you're a highway engineer, for example, you know, you're going to build a road, and maybe, you know, into that earlier question about maybe inductive charging. Well, you know, do you put the do you prepare the infrastructure for inductive charging in that highway before you know, as you plan it, or not? You know, so there's all sorts of things that I think people should try to keep in mind. And yeah, that's, yeah, like you said, you hit me cold, so.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Those are better than I'm probably gonna come up with. I think there's two things that at least I always think about, and they're probably not gonna be any big surprise to anybody or anything be innovative. One is, and Obadiah may know of some that I do not know of, but I have not seen a really, really good, I think robust enough model about what the grid is really gonna look like at this point. At that point, I think I've seen lots of different pieces of it, and some of it might really be that nobody really believes, or, you know, there's a lot of unknowns, you know, and you're gonna have to put a lot of assumptions into that model. But I would really like to see a model that really does, we can pretty confidently predict what the grid conditions are gonna be when we reach that 100%.
So grid conditions, you mean like reliability?
Reliability, impact on the grid, what kind of infrastructure you're gonna need in the grid as a result of that. Some of the things that Obadiah is probably thinking about all the time, you know, when you're talking about load forecasting. And I think related to that, which I tend to think of as two separate issues, but how they would work together, is when we were talking about the V2G. That piece of how that's going to affect the model, and how much of this is going to be in that, you know, in that vein. I don't think we've gotten to the point where we feel confident that we, as an industry, really understand that. And I think that would make a big difference, because that would really help the roadmap and a lot of those things if we can get a really robust model along those lines.
There are quite a few grid models being developed and used around California, and we have one that we think is good, although I don't think it's so strong on V2G. But part of this is probably about getting the word out, getting the results out when different people are doing this kind of modeling, but it's a good point.
Just a quick theme, I think this plays into the group of students and where you're coming from. I'm a systems engineer. I really feel like we all need to be thinking more about the interplay between the energy, the vehicles, and the mobility issue topic. I know that plays well allude to the research that happens here, but I would just encourage everybody to connect those dots. You brought up VMT. We need to be thinking about that more, not just about the mobility with the bus, but how does that affect the reduction on the necessary electricity? So we need to be connecting those dots more quantitatively going forward. My thought for research, the one that maybe there's good research on there already from the utility players, but it's the behavioral choices on the pricing of either demand response or VGI services. What is the kind of the price signal that's going to encourage the plug-in time of day, you know, provide battery service issue that is going to drive scale? To me, those are big unknowns, but really have an effect not just on the planners for the grid, but also for the automakers and how they design the vehicles, the battery capability, if it's going to be a deep discharge vehicle grid service or just a kind of a, you know, modulation.
My business, so that's a good.
Yeah. So for me, that research is a big unknown about what is the price signal that's going to motivate a lot of people to do all this stuff.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, one thought I meant to share was just around thinking about business models and the fact that new ones are popping up every day and they're solving some of the challenges that we talk about. We talked to a multifamily focused company that was starting up that is looking to deploy, you know, level 1 charging strips across like entire parking lots at a very low cost per unit, and make use of the fact that most cars are coming with their own plugs, and this could be, you know, a 80% drop relative to what we're seeing for, you know, current pedestal based charging. So I think, you know, thinking about innovation in business model is important as you're thinking about what do you want to do in your career. I have an idea, here's a gap, here's a problem. There's a lot of innovation, a lot of money pouring into innovation. From a research standpoint, I don't think it's because I was influenced by Beth and Joshua's answers, but this is something that we're thinking about a lot, is what is the price elasticity of charging in the future for different segments, for different commercial segments. There's a diverse set of fleets out there. They all have their charging needs. Within the residential space, there's people who have more optionality and less optionality. There's going to be different vehicle types and duty cycles for those. And making sense of that and thinking about how we optimize that for designing a grid to serve that is a big challenge. We've had decades of studying how people use electricity in buildings, and we really need to merge that transportation perspective of how does people's transportation demand change based on prices they see, and what are they willing to do. The Costco example is a good one for me of like people willing to sit at Costco for 20 minutes to fill their tank to save, $1 or less than $1 a gallon is a perfect example to me of like, wow, people are willing to, essentially save $7 an hour of their time to get the cheaper gas. What does the equivalent look like in the electric space?
Of course, those are a subset of the population, those are Costco shoppers, but still, I mean, there's learning there. There are a lot of them. But those are all great ideas. I think a lot of work does go on that gets at some of this, so I think part of it also is how do researchers get the word out from their research, and maybe it's more blogging, maybe it's TikTok videos, I don't know, but that's part of the equation too. I think we always have to do better on that. Yeah.
And one last thing, just to follow on with what Lou said, or not Lou, with Obadiah. The average amount of miles driven per day in California is about 40 miles. And in an EV, that's about 11.4 kilowatt hours, okay? If you charge at level 1, which is just that 110 volt outlet strip, for 9 hours, you will get 12.96 kilowatt hours. So that means on average, everybody could charge their EV on 110 and be okay, but obviously that's an average.
No, that's true. I mean, on average, we can solve a lot of problems on average, but that's still very important. But in this country, you have to have enough battery power and charging power to tow your house over the Sierras, just in case, right?
That's the exception.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think this has been great, and thanks very much to our panel.
Yeah, I just want to thank all of you, and I do want to especially thank Rachel, Brianna, Raina, and Jean, who are sitting quietly at the back, but who've really been instrumental in kind of helping us put all this together. All masters and PhD students in at ITS between the energy and transportation programs. And the only thing I would say is we have a massive California-India ZEV program now at ITS, where India is trying to learn from the California ZEV story. So while it gives me some level of relief that there are still problems that haven't been solved in California. So, but I think it's very impressive to where California has gotten. And I think that itself can be a very strong learning template for others, while California continues to kind of solve some of the other stuff. But I think I just wanted to kind of mention
that's great.
A lot of what is going on there is now moving outside of the US for others to learn.
Yeah, hopefully not including like that Indians all decide they have to have pickup trucks with a lot of towing capacity.
That's the one thing we don't want to do.
That's probably coming.
Yeah. But anyway, okay, thank you so much, really appreciate it.
I'd also like to thank our corporate sponsor for part of the food and beverages. NG provided funds to help fund the food and beverages.
Squeezing the last.